What's up everyone, my name's Dave and today I'll be using up these offcuts to make another mitered gift box, but this time just using hand tools. The lid in the bottom of this project will be made of this small piece of zebra wood. The faces have already been flattened and squared from a past project since this is just an offcut. And so really I'm just making sure that I have one square edge here. I'm using my hand plane to accomplish this and checking it with my combination square. The sides of the box will be made of this walnut. So here I'm marking out the height of the box. I'll darken everything in with a pencil and then I'll use my handsaw to start ripping the parts to size. I recently found this small 18-inch panel saw at an antique store. I brought it home, cleaned it up, and sharpened it and thought this would be a great project to try it out on. Once I'm done ripping the board down to its rough size, I'll clamp it into my vise, use my hand plane to clean up and square up one edge, and get the board down to the proper width. In order to get all four sides out of this piece of walnut and have good flowing grain on all four corners, as well as make the top and the bottom out of that zebra wood, I need to resaw these pieces. So here I'm marking out the center of each board, and then I'll clamp them back up into my vise, and I'll use a rip saw to cut them down the middle. This is my first time cutting through this zebra wood with hand tools, and I was surprised on how difficult it was to work. So while I'm taking forever to cut through this board, I'd like to take a minute to just say thanks for watching my videos. And if you like them, I hope that you consider subscribing. Definitely leave a comment and give the video a thumbs up. Once I'm done sawing out the top and bottom, I need to repeat the same process as on the side. I'll start by clamping the walnut board into my vise, normally at a 45 like this, so I get more cut out of the saw and I can see my line better. I'll saw down as far as I can, flip the board over, and repeat the process from the other side. Now with the resawing done, I'll get my marking gauge set to the thickness that I want each of the sides of the box to be. I'll mark out the whole board and then I'll plane away all the material to get down to that line. Once I've planed down to my gauge lines and everything's smooth, I'll use my combination square on its edge to make sure there's no high or low spots throughout the middle of the board. I'll put the boards back together in the way that I resawed them, and then mark everything out so I don't lose track of that later. And once that's done, I'll repeat the flattening process and clean up the lid and the bottom of the box. Once I have the width and the thickness of the sides all dialed in, now I'm going to cut the boards down to proper length. I'll start by marking out what's going to be the combination of two sides of the box, and then I'll use my crosscut saw to cut everything to length. Then I'll come back in with my shooting board and hand plane the edges to make them square and smooth. Even though it's not super important with this walnut because it has such a uniform grain, I'm trying to keep the two pieces together in the way that I resawed them so that I can get the corners to all have grain match later. Here I'm marking out a line on the top and the bottom of what's going to be the inside of the boxes, and this is going to be for shoulders that the lid and the bottom of the box rest in. And to cut these joints, I'm going to use one of my favorite tools. I have this small little plow plane, and really easy to use. Just clamp the board up to the side of your workbench, set the depth of the cut on the plane, and use the fence off to the side to set the width, and then you start planing away the material that you need to. I would argue that this process with a hand tool is probably just as efficient as using a router table if you're just making one small little box. Once I've put the grooves in the top and the bottom, I'm ready to cut the box sides to their final length. I'll mark everything out, cut them all to length, and then start marking out where the panels are, making sure that the grain matches on all four sides. This box is going to have an extra feature on it where the lid can flip up and sit in the top of the box. To do that, I need to cut this groove just a little bit wider on the back panel and then two little notches on the side panel. I'll start by making the groove wider here with the little plow plane. But before I cut the notches in the side panels, I'm going to go ahead and take my hand plane and clean up all the inside faces of the boxes. And then I'll take out the mitered shooting board and start to cut the miters in each side. This is another process that's almost just as fast to do with hand tools as it is to do with power tools, and probably a lot safer. Instead of having to set up a table saw and make the 45-degree cuts and then probably end up back at a shooting board to fine-tune the miters and clean up all the saw marks, I could just do the whole thing by hand, and it only takes about 10 minutes to do all the box sides. So usually if I'm making just one of these boxes, I'll do it with hand tools, but if I'm making a batch of 4 or 5, I'll definitely use the power tools. Once the miters are done, I'm ready to start laying out the notches in the side panels. First, I take that back panel that I already made the groove a little bit wider on and use my combination square to match up that depth, and then I'll transfer those marks over to what's going to be the side panels of the boxes. Then I can secure the side panels to my workbench and use a chisel to remove all the waste. I learned this technique to widen these grooves and make a little flip top part for the box from a book by Matt Kenny called Build Better Boxes. I brought this book up in the last little miter box build video that I made, but it's definitely worth re-mentioning it. It's a really good book with a lot of cool tips and tricks, so if you get a chance, check it out. Once I've finished up all the chisel work, I'll take some 220 grit sandpaper and just break all the edges of the shoulder and make sure to remove any tool marks left over from the chisels or the plow plane. The next step is to apply some finish to the insides of the boxes. It's much easier to do this now than after everything's assembled. So here I'm just putting on a couple of coats of shellac that's been thinned down with a little denatured alcohol. It only takes about 15-20 minutes for this to dry before we can move on to the next step. And now I'm ready to start putting this assembly together. I'll put all 4 sides up against a known straight edge. In this case it's my workbench and then just a board that I made sure plain straight and flat. And I'll apply some tape to all 4 corners. Then I can flip the whole assembly over, make sure it's still lined up against my straight edge, and then I'm putting a little bit of tape right up next to the miters just because I tend to be a little bit messy with the glue, and this will make cleanup a little bit easier. Now I'm ready to apply some glue. Here I'm using Titebond 3 because that's really all I keep in the shop. It's really good glue. I've never had a problem with it. It's never failed on me. So I'll start by putting a thin coat on, and I'll let that soak in until it kind of turns clear. And then I'll come back in and apply a second coat just to make sure I have enough glue in each joint. Then I can put all the joints together by folding over one side to the next until I get to the end, and I'll take this last bit of tape and pull it tight, and that'll bring all 4 corners in line and tight. Now I can do a quick check to make sure the box sides are square, and then I'll set this to the side to dry. After letting the parts cure overnight, I came in the next morning and removed all the tape, and then it was time to start working on fitting the top and the bottom to the box. I'm going to start with the bottom, and to get a really good tight fit, I'm going to use my shooting board and a hand plane. I'll start by shaving down one side and test fitting it, and then I'll come back in and just keep fine tuning it with the shooting board until I get a really good tight fit. Then I'll use some 220 grit sandpaper on a flat surface just to true up the bottom and clean up the edges. Next I'll apply some glue to the bottom shoulder, being real careful not to get it to the inside of the box. Fit the bottom onto it, clamp everything in place, and let it sit for about 30 minutes. Once the glue's had a little bit of time to dry, I'll remove the clamps and then start fitting the top. I'm using the same method as I used on the bottom, a shooting board and a hand plane, and I'll just keep inching up on the fit until I get it exactly how I want it. Once I have the lid fitted properly, I'll clamp the whole assembly up in my workbench and use a small block plane just to clean up the sides and get rid of any residual glue that may have squeezed out. And here I'm just using a sanding block and some 220 grit sandpaper just to finesse the sides a little bit and make sure I didn't leave any plane tracks. To make the lid not look so blocky, I'm going to create a chamfer on the top edges of it. I'm going to use a block plane for this, and I'll just rest it up against my workbench at a 45-degree angle. I'll start on the edges because hand planes have a tendency to blow out the ends or cause some tear out when cutting across the grain. I'll start there first, and then I'll do the long sides, and that'll clean up any tear out that I get from the short sides and give me good crisp edges. Now I'm ready to start working on the handle for the lid. And to do that, I'm going to take a handsaw and cut out a piece of the leftover walnut that I have. Then I can come in with my hand plane and square up and clean up one face or edge. And then I'll cut off the excess just so I have the handle at the right length that I want. And now the fun part is I'm going to take a carving chisel and start to add some texture and shape to it. And once I'm done carving everything out with the gouge, I'll come in with a rasp and shape the rest of the handle. Then I'll come back in with some 220 grit sandpaper just to clean everything up and smooth it out. To attach the handle to the lid, I'll start by centering the handle on the lid. Use some masking tape to mark that out. Then I can apply some super glue. Apply pressure from the handle to the lid for about 10 seconds. Then I can remove the masking tape and I'm ready for the next step. For the finish on this box is going to be pretty simple. I'm using more of that shellac that's been thinned down with denatured alcohol. And I'll start by applying a couple of coats to it just till I start to see a shine. Once that's had a little bit of time to dry, I'll come in with some 600 to 800 grit sandpaper and just knock back all the surfaces till I can get all that glossiness off and everything silky smooth. Next, I'll add 2 or 3 more coats of the shellac. Now I'll use some 4/0 steel wool to knock back the glossiness again. Then I'll apply some paste wax with a 4/0 steel wool. Here I'm using a brand called Renaissance Wax, but any paste wax will make it look great. And once the wax has had a little bit of time to dry, I'll come in with a microfiber towel and just start buffing out all the surfaces. A little bit goes a long way with this wax, and I'll normally put on about 2 coats, and here you can see how glossy and shiny it comes out at the end. And after a couple of coats of wax, you can see how great this box turned out. I'm really happy with the color combinations and how it works, and here you can see the lid, how it flips right open. Just really cool project for hand tools. And I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I will see you guys in the next video.